of the Philippines. I am Edna Ko, Professor of Public Administration at the University of the Philippines, and likewise Director of the UP CFAL Philippines. CFAL is a United Training and Research. I am pleased to welcome everyone to this webinar. It's called Caring in the Time of COVID-19, Gaps and Risks Facing Filipino Women. While the title says it's Filipino women, it may not gaps and risks and issues facing Filipino women, but you may find similarity and identification with the cases and issues that will be taken up for this afternoon. This webinar aims to show the socio-economic impacts of the COVID pandemic on women, whether women in the context of human rights, trafficked to women in different countries under a pandemic, the issues of women migrant workers under a pandemic. Therefore, I welcome everyone, and I thank also the co-organizers of UPCFAL Philippines, and I'd like to mention the co-organizers here, the UN Women, the ILO, or the International Labor Organization, the Commission on Human Rights, Women and Gender Institute, and of course, our respectable and very revered expert, Oy de Dios also. I wish to thank and welcome people who signed up to this webinar. Indonesia, Mexico, the United States, Egypt, Somalia, China, India, and Peru. And of course, everyone who joined us today from the Philippines. While our issues may revolve around discussion of difficulties, challenges, problems, we don't want to see only problems to the issues of women under this pandemic. We also want to do a conversation and an exploration on possible solutions. Even prior to the pandemic, there are already existing or pre-existing inequalities and women's exposition to various vulnerabilities. The pandemic even puts such vulnerabilities to a higher level and immense pressure, not just on women, but on the rest of humankind. This means that immediately stronger pressure by at least 50% more as women hold half of the world's population. The pandemic has deprived women of their jobs, put them at heightened risks of violence in the home, especially at lockdown. Women suffer deprivation of social protection, and half of those losing jobs due to this pandemic might also be women. When men lose their jobs, women come forward and tide over. And in many cases, women themselves do the jobs. In the end, we hope to explore options in a multilateral way. We want to see and explore options seen by national agencies of our government, by international organizations, by communities, by women themselves, and by civil society. In doing this webinar, we hope that the UPCFAL Philippines, together with all our partners in this webinar, contribute to a discourse and an enlightenment on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is gender equality. As well, Sustainable Development Goal number, which is about decent employment and the conditions at the workplace. To kick off this seminar, let me call and let me thank in a special way for agreeing to serve as moderator of this discussion, our dear Executive Director of the Miriam College Women and Gender Institute, Executive Director Dr. Tessa De Vella. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Around 200 people have signed up and have joined us in this particular webinar. And we hope more are getting in to sign up. Thank you so much and good day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edna. Okay, so I think that was the most fitting welcome and introduction and framing to our discussion today. We do have a few house rules before we begin, and I think they're going to be flashed on the screen. So you may have noticed among our participants from the Philippines and all over the world, you are muted. This is really just to ensure the quality of the audio exchange particulars. You'll also take note perhaps of the rule that questions will be through the Q&A box. Okay, and most importantly perhaps is we may not have all the time to answer all of the questions. The speakers may not have all the time to answer all the questions, so please feel free to speak with your co-participants and to answer their questions, comments as well through the Q&A box. And then lastly, this forum is being recorded, so in the event that you may have missed it or want to listen to it again or share it with your friends, you can do so. It will be shared by Sifal. So those are our house rules, pretty simple and I think quite standard. So we'll go straight now into our conversation today, caring in the time of COVID-19, gaps and risks facing Filipino women. I think essentially, as Dr. Ko explained, this forum really wants to put in a simple way, say that gender matters in addressing the COVID crisis. And it's very common when faced with a national crisis or international crisis that gender issues take a back seat or seen as less important. This conversation today is to say that we can't do that. We shouldn't do that. And addressing these issues is part of addressing the pandemic. To zero in some of those very key issues, to talk about who really are some of those most vulnerable women at this time. We have 4 speakers with us. Okay, let me first introduce, and I believe they will flash themselves as I call them on, so some element of surprise for our viewers. So as soon as I've introduced them, you will see their faces flashed on the screen. So let me begin with introducing Maria Rosalyn Messena from UN Women. Rosalyn, or Len, is Philippines Programs Manager for We Empower Asia, a program of the UN Women Asia Pacific, focusing on women's economic empowerment, implemented in 7 countries in Asia. She is a development worker and a community educator with sociology for her undergraduate studies and community development for her master's degree, both from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Prior to joining the UN Women, she was project lead for the Makati Business Club's research on women's leadership in the corporate setting, and worked with the Commission on Human Rights to develop a framework on how to set up gender-based violence observatory. So, welcome, Len, Miss Len. Okay, so hopefully your photo's there. Okay, moving on to our next speaker. We have, speaking of the Commission on Human Rights, we have a commissioner, Commissioner Karen Gomez Dumpit from the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines. So she is the focal commissioner for gender equality and women's rights and the first director of the CHR Child's Rights Center. She holds an AB Mass Communication Arts degree from De La Salle University, Master's in Public Management from the Department of Academy of the Philippines, and an MS in Human Rights from the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. Welcome, Commissioner Karen. Okay, and speaking of political science, we have a political scientist, Professor Aurora Oye de Dios from the Miriam College Women and Gender Institute. Aurora de Dios is the Senior Project Director of the Miriam College Women and Gender Institute. She has worked as the Philippines representative for women's rights to the ASEAN Commission on the promotion and protection of the rights of women and children. She completed her BS in Foreign Service, MA in Asian Studies, and currently completing her PhD in Philippine Studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. I think the other important hat of Professor de Dios is she is the founding president of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Because I believe much of what she's going to share with us today will be based on her involvement with CATW. Last but not least is from our friend and colleague from the International Labour Organization, Rex Barona. Rex Barona is the National Project Coordinator of the Safe and Fair Program of ILO Philippines, jointly implemented with UN Women Philippines, among other partners. He has worked as the East and Southeast Asia Coordinator of Migrant Forum in Asia, and his academic background includes a BS in Community Development, also from the University of the Philippines. So those are our very experienced, very qualified, and I think we're very privileged to have this panel of speakers with us today, a very nice variety. And we will go straight into our first speaker, but I will just remind the speakers that it's 15 minutes each. I hope we can remain within that time. 15 minutes each for the presentations. There will be some reminders of timing should you go over. Perhaps also keep in mind that we have an international audience in this webinar today. We can begin, and we'll have the open forum at the end of the fourth speaker's presentation. So let's begin with our first speaker from the Commission of Human Rights, Commissioner Karen Dumpit. Karen?
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me begin, of course, by thanking the organizers of this webinar headed by UP-CFAL Philippines for this opportunity to share my thoughts on the human rights situation, including that of women during this COVID-19 pandemic. Just to say that the Commission on Human Rights truly appreciates efforts like this that popularize human rights issues and concerns. Thank you for the opportunity, of course, to be partnering with you today. COVID-19 has been the most talked about topic in recent months. Its effects on our lives are very real, and every day we read about lives lost because of this dreaded disease. We hear about people who need to go to work to earn some money to feed their families. News contain the stories about violence and abuses that come with the implementation of quarantine rules and protocols. Human rights issues and violations persist. They are, however, amplified in this pandemic. In the next 15 minutes, next slide please, allow me to walk you through three main points to start our conversation about human rights and gender dimensions of COVID-19. I will begin by discussing some of the human rights directly affected by the pandemic, as well as its disproportionate effect to vulnerable and marginalized sectors of society. I will also highlight the commendable efforts of government in their responses. And my next point actually focuses on the gender dimensions of COVID. Given the limited time, I intend to put forward the main issues of women as monitored by and reported to the Commission on Human Rights. And as a final note, allow me to just share with you the Commission's responses and initiatives related to women's rights and issues as we carry out our mandate as the Gender Ombudsman and a national human rights institution. Next slide, please. While All human rights are interconnected and interrelated. The violation of some human rights are more pronounced during this pandemic and accompanying government response to it. The COVID-19 pandemic brought attention to the people's right to health. And in the past months, we have seen how inadequate and unprepared our health care system is to deal with a pandemic of this magnitude. This may not be new knowledge to us, but even before the COVID-19, our healthcare services have not been adequate, especially in dealing with disease outbreaks in geographically isolated areas. Freedom of movement is also a right that is affected by COVID-19 response, especially if we talk about quarantine measures and the imposition of curfews. It has to be noted, though, that the public health emergency are valid restrictions to this freedom, so long as the restrictions are not discriminatory. In a recent issued advisory of the Commission on Freedom of Movement, the Commission has put forth recommendations to government regarding the utilization and implementation of quarantine measures, checkpoints, and curfew ordinances that are consistent with human rights. The CHR also expressed alarm and concern about the human rights violations occasioned by the arrests and detention during the enhanced community quarantine. While violators were apprehended for violating the quarantine and curfew rules and protocols, the same must be done in accordance with law, and the penalty should not be harsh and inhumane. News reports also on violators being put in cages and some violators being made to stay under the heat of the sun have been monitored. Some violators belonging to the LGBTQI+ community were forced to do humiliating acts like kissing or dancing as punishment. Along with the implementation of quarantine measures come issues related to the right to food. And because of people's limited mobility, access to food sources became challenging. While LGUs have been providing food packs to its constituents, food or access to food is not very easy for some sectors of society, such as older persons. And of course, the right to livelihood and lack of adequate social safety nets is also a major concern. Next slide, please. COVID-19 disproportionately affects marginalized sectors of society. And while the pandemic affects everyone, those with existing vulnerabilities are doubly burdened. And let me give you snapshots of some vulnerable groups that the CHR has gathered through its continuing monitoring and reports that were submitted. And of course, concomitant with this is the Commission's response to these issues. First, of course, is persons deprived of liberty. Of course, are very vulnerable to COVID, especially given the conditions in our prisons and detention facilities. Just the other day, I read that the congestion rates, the average is as high as 500%. So you can just imagine how this is very dangerous for our persons deprived of liberty. So the CHR has recommended steps to decongest our jails, such as early release of older persons, low-risk and non-violent persons deprived of liberty, persons with chronic medical condition, and those charged with bailable offenses, but who cannot afford bail. We laud, of course, the efforts of the Supreme Court to allow the release of poor persons deprived of liberty during this pandemic. Second is, of course, indigenous peoples who already do not have adequate access to healthcare and other services. And they also stand to be disproportionately affected by this health crisis. Apart from threats of COVID-19, reports of Mangyans in Mindoro who cannot access basic commodities are also unable to sell their produce due to restrictions brought about by the enforcement of the Enhanced Community Quarantine, or ECQ. Older persons are more susceptible to COVID primarily because of comorbidities, limited resources, and lessened mobility. And crisis responses should take into consideration their differential needs and challenges. As we all know, a one-size-fits-all response tends to overlook the specific yet wide-ranging risks faced by older people in emergency contexts. Recently, the Commission actually issued a statement saying that simple application of chronological age to restrict movement of older persons, including access to mass transportation, may prove to be violative of older persons' rights, particularly those who are healthy enough to go out of their houses and access essential services as well. Homeless persons also stand to suffer by quarantine measures, primarily because they have no place to go home to. And of course, we know that children in street situations are likewise at greater risk of abuse and violence. Next slide, please. I think it would be unfair not to mention or to not mention the best practices of some government agencies and other sectors in responding to COVID-19 pandemic. The Commission uses OK cards. OK means, stands for obligasyon, which is obligation, and karapatan, which is rights. So it's OK cards. And this initiative began even before the COVID pandemic. You see on your screens some of these initiatives. For instance, PhilHealth or Philippine Insurance Agency is providing coverage for COVID-19 patients. And then the initiative, of course, of our Vice President, which alleviates the situation of our frontliners who are being discriminated against in their places of dwelling. And she instituted or developed this project on dormitories and related services, including free internet and rooming services for our frontliners. We also looked at some LGUs who have chosen more humane ways of dealing with violators and trying to understand the situation and frustrations they are experiencing. Mobile markets in the cities of Pasig and Valenzuela is also a notable initiative in this regard. Next slide, please. Similar to vulnerable groups mentioned earlier, women are also disproportionately affected by COVID-19. The Commission's Gender Equality and Women's Human Rights Center recently produced a report on the access to services of women with disabilities during this pandemic. Among the issues surfaced are lack of medical attention, access to medicines, infant formula, and other needs of infants, lack of relief goods and financial assistance from local government units or LGUs, the need for reproductive health supplies, services and commodities, lack of transportation services for those who need to be brought to hospitals. The Gender Equality and Human Rights Center of the Commission has made recommendations to local governments to address these concerns. Next slide, please. Women also have specific concerns during this pandemic, including pre- and postnatal checkups and safe delivery for pregnant women, increase in the number of cases of domestic violence, and lack of income for women heads of households. Because of quarantine measures, women are doubly burdened with having to make do with less to manage their households, and women have added duties when the whole family is at home. Those with other vulnerabilities due to their work, situation, or age, like female older persons or healthcare workers, also tend to suffer more. Next slide, please. At this point, allow me to share some of the responses and initiatives of the Commission in relation to the issues and concerns of women and girls. Even during this pandemic, the Commission continues to perform its mandate both as the country's national human rights institution as well as the Gender Ombudsman. And we do this through our 3 pillars of work: human rights protection, human rights advocacy and promotion, and human rights policy advisory work. Next slide, please. Utilizing online platforms, the Commission continues to investigate and respond to gender-based violence cases through its e-lawyering and e-reporting projects. To a limited extent, the CHR has provided shelter support to some clients, since the ones providing temporary shelters have also closed down because of quarantine regulations. So persons who experience or would want to report gender-based and other human rights violations can get in touch with our National Capital Region Office, or any regional office for that matter, of the Commission on Human Rights, and our investigation office to avail of our e-lawyering services. And the hotlines are on your screen right now. Next slide, please. We also capitalized on other available platforms to continue providing information and education, communication activities to discuss human rights concerns. And this webinar is actually an example of that. Next slide, please. The Commission also continues to issue statements and advisories that address specific human rights issues and concerns. We have reminded government that addressing domestic and sexual violence against women should be given priority amid this COVID situation. And we have also issued advisories and statements calling for the need to address the needs of women during this pandemic, and specifically to address online sexual exploitation of women. Specific to pregnant women, we have issued a statement stressing the importance of ensuring maternal and infant health. In the same statement, we provided recommendations to our Department of Health in this area, including the provision of unhampered access to sexual and reproductive health services and ensuring clean and safe delivery facilities, among others. Our statement on the ban on older persons and pregnant women using our trains highlighted the possibility of discrimination and exposing them to more danger as they would naturally use other modes of public transportation. Instead of a total ban, we recommended strict hygiene protocols and the use of priority lanes and separate coaches for older persons and pregnant women. Next slide, please. As we live in uncertain times, let me assure you that the Commission on Human Rights will continue to work for the human rights and dignity of all. It is in fact during these most uncertain times that we should be more watchful and vigilant. I encourage everyone to help us perform our mandate by partnering with us through this initiative that we are having, or reporting violations. Again, on behalf of the Commission on Human Rights, let me reiterate our gratitude and congratulations to the organizers of this webinar, our co-organizers, of course, headed by UPCPAL Philippines. And I look forward to continuing our conversation later during the open forum. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Karen. Okay, we will thank you as well for keeping within the time. We will now move on to our next speaker, Ms. Lenlen from UN Women. Ms. Lenlen.
Yes, thank you, Tessa. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, UPCPAL, together with all the fellow organizers of this webinar, for having the UN Women part of this conversation. We are very pleased to share with you the work that we have been doing, and for my time allocation, let me walk you through 3 to 4 key areas of my discussion, which would just primarily cover or reiterate Karen's sharing earlier. It's really our concern linked to the impact of the COVID-19 on women and girls, what the UN Women Program Office in the Philippines is doing in general, and how our specific programs at the moment is also trying to respond to the issue and the observations that we've been seeing on the ground together with our partner organizations. And hopefully key areas moving forward that we could all take on as different sectors and stakeholders in trying to address the effects and impact of the pandemic, not just in the general community, but making sure that we don't leave anyone behind, especially the vulnerable groups, that includes women and girls. I'm not sure if my slide is working well. So the COVID-19 pandemic really poses a challenge in the progress that we have been making for women. And that's why we see we need to really be very mindful about the different programs and responses that are being implemented at the moment. we'd like to highlight that in the last quarter of December of 2019, we slid from top 8 ranking in the World Economic Forum Gender Equality Index rating from top 8 to top 16, primarily because of the lowered political participation level of women. So we have gathered positive rating on health and survival, economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we fear that we will lose these gains because a lot of this has also been discussed by Karen already. On health and survival, we see that because of the terrible effect of the pandemic, nobody really is ready to tackle and address this. And SRHR issues, concerns are sort of set aside, and people who are supposed to be responding to this, providing the services needed by the women and by young girls, are not prioritized. Pregnant, older, PWDs, women from the IP communities, and migrants access to hospitals and healthcare issues are also very much challenged at this time, especially during the early times of the ECQ, when a lot of our healthcare service facilities are really swamped with COVID-19 cases, and they don't know where to place and how to really address, despite all their efforts to prepare and accommodate as much as they can. There are really times that they are missing out on supporting these particular groups. Gender-based violence and violence against women concerns are not addressed as emergencies anymore because our law enforcement, instead of focusing on enforcing the laws and trying to keep the chaos from happening, are also moved to tackle COVID issues instead of tackling all the other possible concerns at the community level, which includes violence against women. And we have been hearing stories that rape victims, harassment victims are turned away or asked to come back because they do not have the resource to tackle them or support them at the moment. Economic participation, I know everyone are very familiar how hardly hit the small business, the small medium enterprises are. And these businesses and sectors which are hit the most employ the most number of women. And a lot of the setup is no work, no pay arrangement. So we can just imagine, we have seen just only 50% labor force participation of the women, but because of the COVID-19 and the ECQ and all of the other implications, businesses are closing down or they have limited their operations, which directly impacts the opportunity of women to bring home and to have their salaries in place. MSMEs shut down and slow down as well. Educational attainment, this is, I think, up to now is really a huge challenge, not just for the families who are going to send their children to school, but also to our educational sector, because the access to online education is still very challenging to a lot of people, especially children for that matter. IT literacy level, when we will be moving from an offline to an online educational session, is also something we need to still prepare for. And apparently, a lot of these concerns when it comes to technology, access to gadgets and skill sets and opportunities to use the different equipment linked to technology, women are far behind than men, or girls are far behind than boys. Vulnerability to online abuse is also something that we want to flag, given that a lot of the online abuses and exploitation also are happening in this space at this point in time. Political participation, on the other hand, we still see a very minimal voice of women when it comes to the situation and in the decision making as to the IATF's pronouncements and rules. And we hope to see more of that when it comes to really trying to address or tackle the situation of women. Women's voice in overall governance and response and management in the COVID-19 is also something we want to see more of, but that is something that we still need to, I think, push for or remind everyone. So the UN Women's work is in 4 key strategic areas. This is in governance, in trying to promote economic autonomy and income security, eliminating violence and discrimination against girls and women, and contributing to influence for sustainable peace and security in the country. The Philippine Program Office at the moment has 4 key program areas that tackles this strategic work of the UN Women. One is the Safe and Fair program, which I think would be shared by Rex more later as he tackle his sharing or discussion. Second is the Women, Peace and Security, where we see women's leadership and help in sustaining peace in specific areas, especially in the BARM. Third is enhancing women's access to justice, which is linked to women who are incarcerated or access to justice and support to these women. And last is on my program, which is the We Empower Asia on economic empowerment. So let me walk you through the different impacts that we have been seeing from all of these programs. And actually, a lot of them have been mentioned by Commissioner Karen already. In all of these program areas, we see that there really is inadequate and insensitive social protection. The tendency at this time is to have a blanket protocol, blanket support, blanket program, which missed out on a lot of the different unique needs of women and girls. There is also the continuing and really doubling or tripling of the unpaid care work. The economic and financial insecurity that is brought about by the ECQ or the lockdown, and the continuous violence and exploitation, which have been become more silent because of a lot of it are happening within the households, and no support is immediately available because of the limitation to mobility and or movement of the citizens. So on the WPS side, really we see intensifying social exclusion that the COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the situation to exclude people, especially women, especially in the BARM area, on trying to access different services. It has increased risk for the IDP community because of their situation and setup, that they could not really decide on the space and the place where they will be. On the GBV component, we see the prevalence is increasing in terms of VOW, domestic violence, intimate partner abuse. The mobility restrictions and safety further put women at risk, and the harassment and discrimination in the checkpoints, in trying to access the different services. And yeah, on the economic side, I think I've mentioned that already, the closure of business, especially those hiring women, insecurity and job loss, which links to the very limited or zero labor protection for most of these women. On the last aspect, on the access to justice, we see that the documentation of HR violations have become more challenging, especially at this time. The disruption and the delay in hearings and the then limited, now almost zero access to legal and social services for incarcerated women has been observed as well. These issues are on, shares the same undercurrents about lack of sex disaggregated data, which we have been really, really looking for since time immemorial, but it is something we need to highlight and we need to continuously call for, because responsive programming will not really be effective if we are blinded when it comes to the data set that we have. We are missing narratives of women from BARM, from IP, from the migrants communities, older women, PWDs, and incarcerated women. We thank the Commission on Human Rights for really trying to shed light to stories and certain cases from these women. But we hope that the different agencies who are responsible to address their issues could also really come up with very good documentation of how this pandemic is really impacting women negatively. We also see the need and strong need for now more than ever gender responsive protocols in the response and recovery planning, especially now that we are slowly opening up the economy and moving to the GCQ, which is something we have been discussing earlier, linked to the mobility, the transportation needs, and the risk exposure of everyone when they would report to work. So response and actions of the UN Women moving forward, I think this is something we have linked to the current programs, and we hope to see more of this and more people and more organizations to work with us on this as well. For the women, peace and security aspect is delivering livelihood support to women in the BARM. We hope to also conduct digital literacy training for women so that they could also tackle the issue of hate speech and misogyny and linking that to COVID-19, which bars them from, opening up and also representing their voices, supporting women's CSO advocacies at the BARM area, and the commission, the LGUs, and the BARM government. For the Safe and Fair program, or the GBV, addressing GBV, there's really continuous conduct of rapid gender assessment in different areas with our partner organizations, continuously reminding and requesting different government agencies to provide us and make available gender disaggregate data, offering support to different agencies in tracking and monitoring cases. And at one point, we also try to support the different law enforcement units in providing counseling. We are really working on making sure that there are gender responsive protocols in place, especially for women migrant workers. On the economic empowerment side, the continuous assessment on the impacts of COVID-19 on business, MSMEs, and employees with a women and gender lens perspective. We've been hosting Women Rise Above COVID discussion series, which links and allows us to discuss different topics and concerns of women linked to COVID. We also have set up learning platform for women MSMEs so that they could slowly transition their offline business to digital platforms, and an online training that we are hoping to launch in July to prepare for online work opportunities for women. The last is really the call for an increased data on women detainees and how they are exposed to COVID-19, how to document, monitor the disruptions in justice services, and make sure it continuously happen and evolve, and monitoring of advanced cases in the legal system. We hope to really intensify coordination and collaboration with different organizations and partners, push for more policy and advocacy work in these areas as well. So I'd be flashing as well the different program managers in charge of the different areas of work that we are doing, just so you can get in touch with us and see if there's an opportunity for us to work together. That's all from the UN Women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lennon. Wow, we're doing very well on time. Okay, so we'll move now on to Professor De Jos. Professor Oyi, are you there? Great. Professor Oyi, are you there? Okay, maybe she's taken a break. Should we go on to the next? Oh yeah, there she is. Okay, yes, great.
Yes. Okay, good afternoon to everyone. Congratulations to the organizers for especially to CIFAL Philippines for making this webinar possible. This afternoon, my topic is caring for traffic victims, and I'd like to share some of the experience so far from different chapters of the coalition during the time of COVID. I have a very brief sharing with you this afternoon. One is to just give you some idea of the numbers that we have so far in the Philippines, as well as many of the risks that are experienced by trafficked women who are women and girls who are some of the most vulnerable sectors in our society. Even before this pandemic, as trafficking in human beings, particularly women and children, has been a long time human rights crisis that has affected almost all countries across the globe. And for this reason, the international community came up with the optional protocol on trafficking in women, which is the legal instrument that bounds all governments to address this particular human rights problem. The CATW is one of the most, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is one of the oldest networks that have been established to address this issue. It's a 30-year network that has chapters in Europe, in Asia, Pacific and Latin America, as well as in the Middle East. It was organized particularly, and this is significant, mainly by activists with the help of trafficking survivors. And that's how we got to know that the issue of trafficking is a human rights crisis from the lived experience of the survivors. So I'd like to give you an idea of the numbers according to the Global Report on Trafficking. Next slide, please. The first slide on numbers. The second slide. Excuse me. With the numbers, the first one, the second slide, please. Should I do it? The first slide after the title, please.
Prof, or you will just, I think the one flashing is the first PowerPoint that you sent. We'll just change it to the revised one.
Yes. So just give you an idea of the magnitude of trafficking. At the moment, there are 44 million people trafficked across the globe for different reasons. And there are 73% of these victims are victims of sexual exploitation. 68% are victims of forced labor. 64% are victims of labor exploitation. And 42%, particularly of women and girls, were led to forced marriages. The Philippines trafficking numbers stands at around 700,000 women and girls, particularly women and girls, both domestic and international. And for that reason, the Philippines is 12th in rank in the number of trafficking incidents compared to other countries. Some of the trends that have been seen in the last so many months, particularly during the time of the pandemic, is that there is an increasing number of girls, younger and younger girls, are lured and are victimized by traffickers. And secondly, during the lockdown, while everything is closed and many of the entertainment bars have been forced to close, there is an increase, a significant jump in the viewership of Pornhub and other online platforms sexually exploiting women and girls. Now, we know that trafficking involves three elements. That is the transfer, recruitment, and harboring of women, girls, or even men through forced deception, and exploitation of the vulnerability of people. And it is also for the purpose of sexual exploitation, forced labor, or organ trafficking. And the main targets of traffickers are, of course, children and adolescents, women and men who are also vulnerable. Women experience higher rates of modern slavery in domestic work, the sex industry, and forced marriage. And men are more likely to be exploited in forced labor in construction and manufacturing sectors and the fishing sectors. The conditions of vulnerability are similar across the board. Firstly is the severe poverty and lack of economic opportunities of communities where women and girls are left out and left behind. It is also the trend that we have seen in most countries that after a big environmental disaster where communities are left in chaos without assistance, traffickers tend to prey on this chaotic situation to traffic women and girls. Conditions of war and conflict are also magnets for traffickers, as it has happened in many conflict areas in Africa, as well as in the Balkan countries, where women and girls are targeted for rape, as well as forced marriages. Refugee camps have also been identified as possible areas of trafficking because of the dislocation of family members from community and family support structures. Undocumented migrants as well, who have no papers and who are in the grip of the grip of traffickers are more likely to be trafficked either domestically and particularly internationally. In the United States, women and girls who are alienated from families for various reasons and run away from home are easy targets for traffickers, particularly for the sex industry. And young women with previous sexual abuse experience that fall prey to the promises of a promising sex career. Now, what are the impacts? What are the impacts of COVID-19 on victims of trafficking? Can I have that? Can I have that slide, please? Impact of COVID-19 on victims of trafficking. It has been mentioned already that lockdowns, travel restrictions, resource cutbacks, and other measures to curb the spread of the new coronavirus are putting victims of human trafficking at risk of further exploitation, while organized crime networks could further profit from the pandemic. This is according to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. With COVID-19 restricting the movement of people, diverting law enforcement resources, and reducing social and public services, human trafficking victims have even less chance to escape and look for assistance and help. Next, please. Traffickers may also become more active and prey on people who are even more vulnerable than before because they have lost their source of income due to measures to control the virus. An example of this would be the most impoverished women who have to resort to prostitution to feed their children. So in many countries such as India and the Philippines, we see a phenomenon called sex for rent to pay for their shelters, as well as sex for food, which we also find here in the Philippines. Hindered access to services and support for victims and survivors due to temporarily closed shelters and disrupted services by NGOs and service providers also pose a problem. And for migrants that have been victimized in trafficking, risk that their return to their countries of origin may be delayed or precipitated even if the persons concerned face serious health and protection risks in the countries of return. I'd like to now give you an idea of the dimensions of lifelong well-being for survivors of trafficking. This was crafted by not only academics, but the survivors themselves. And they were asked, what to you is the most important thing in trying to care for your well-being? And they mentioned a few of these. One is body sovereignty, which is to say that for women who have survived abuse, it's important that safety of their bodies is assured. Freedom from harm, which is freedom from all kinds of restrictions in terms of movement, as well as freedom from fear. Sustenance, meaning the basic needs are responded to. Mutual care, which is to say that they are given care and trusted by others. The ability to voice and express their opinion. The right to belong and to have their own identity, and to have a meaningful and satisfactory purpose in life. And lastly, the idea that social protection should also be extended, particularly to victims of trafficking who may not have the legal status to be given such social protection by governments. So what is CETW International as well as local chapters are doing? I think this goes across the board. One is, of course, the immediate sustenance of victims who are locked down and who are in positions where they cannot feed their children. The next slide, please. This is a weekly distribution of food packages for 150 victims of trafficking and also victims of the extrajudicial killing in the Philippines since the lockdown. They are given 100 weekly distribution since March, and the money is coming from private donations of individuals as well as groups. Next slide, please. One of the things that we realized, in most cases, victims of abuse need immediate assistance to report their cases of abuse to government as well as private individuals. Since the lockdown, these have become inaccessible, and hotlines are critically important in trying to reach these kinds of services and to connect them with trauma and counseling services. So this is provided through the help of UNFPA in the Philippines. Next, please. It is important that at a time when there is little information by way of regular channels, that we make use of technology. And radio is still the most widely available technology for information dissemination. And for this, we make use of our weekly program in DZRH in the Philippines to connect with our national as well as regional partners. And so this is how we also know what is happening to other countries. Here we have our representatives from Australia, from Indonesia, as well as Ruchira Gupta from India. Our international office also conducts regular webinar on the entitled Edge of the Margins, which is about the situation of traffic victims all across the different regions of the world. Next, please. We have, there is a picture here that probably will not reflect there. This is the next project, ongoing project that in fact has become even more urgent during and after COVID-19, which is the reintegration of returning migrants who may or may not have been trafficked, as well as traffic victims. We have workshops and livelihood projects on weaving as well as sewing. And I am happy to note that the IACAT, or the Interagency Council Against Trafficking, in persons, especially women and girls, have partnered with our organizational network, DAWN, in order to have a ready-made livelihood project for returning traffic victims, and this is going to start soon. Lastly, the last part of my presentation are the recommendations, which is coming from our from many quarters. Among them, our partners in Europe, the European Women's Lobby, the Women's Equality, and many around 300 organizations have written a special request to the UN Secretary General to please grant an emergency fund for traffic victims during the time of COVID, because these are people, marginalized women and families who have been left out and are not covered by the legally by current assistance programs of governments. For migrants who have been trafficking victims, we also would like to request a grant of extended temporary residence permits to migrants and asylum seekers and traffic victims, regardless of their legal status, so they can have access to health care and other emergency welfare services. We also note that there is a need to prioritize resources for exit services for those in the sex industry, and give them pathways exit pathways, and to be given real alternatives and real livelihoods. The third is to provide victims of trafficking with access to safe and immediate accommodation. As I mentioned, many of them live in squalid conditions and are sometimes kicked out of whatever accommodation they have. And for this, they are driven to prostitution. So immediate accommodation, including temporary quarantine accommodation, healthcare and psychological assistance, to help them exit from trafficking situations. It's also very urgent and important for trafficking victims to be given protection and assistance, including work permits and access to services for those located or not trapped in different countries. For this to be extended, such assistance will be extended for at least 6 months during the duration of COVID-19 to ensure continuity in their social inclusion process beyond the current health crisis. Again, there is a need for online support to victims of trafficking inside and outside shelters, including psychological counseling, legal support, as well as educational and training activities. I think this is more or less what we have to share. The situation of trafficking victims are dire and need immediate and urgent attention. And this requires not only the government responding, though we have the Philippines has been hailed as #1 in Tier 1 in responding to trafficking cases. But there are many gaps in current risks that are being experienced by trafficking. Among others is their immediate physical sustenance and accommodation to help them tide over the crisis. So thank you very much for this chance to explain our work.
Thank you so much, Prof. Oyi. Okay, and we go now to our last speaker, Mr. Rex Verona. Rex, are you there?
Yes.
Sir
Hi, all.
Rex? Okay,
Yes.
could you turn on your camera just so people know it's really you?
I think I'm on, yes.
You're on? There you go. Okay, great.
Yeah, can I just share my screen now? Okay, so my other colleagues have already focused on the other aspects, and thanks, Professor Oyi, for touching on trafficking. So I will not touch on it anymore. So I'll go straight to how the pandemic has impacted on women, migrants in general. So I'll be focusing more on the risks and the gaps that we need to address Just as to context, there are more than 6 million infected already, and the curve says that it's not yet flattening globally, at least in Asia perhaps, but in other parts of the world, the pandemic is still spreading quite fast. To give us some figures, the Philippines is actually among the top 20% of countries with the most number of cases. This has been true since March and until now. So we are hitting about 20,000. It's slowing down, but I think we are still among the countries, especially in ASEAN. We are top 3 in terms of the number of infections and especially death. I'm just showing some trending now. I will not discuss this now, but as you can see from the graph, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore are among the countries with the most number of cases. I'm starting with this discussion because the next question would be, how are the Filipino migrants affected? So latest data from June 3 says that there are more than 5,000 already abroad that have been infected. And they are pretty much from all over the world. And I'm saying that because if we now therefore say that in the Philippines, there are only about 20,000 cases, actually if we count the number of Filipinos overseas that have been infected, about 5,000, then we are having about 25,000 cases. And among the deaths also, we don't only have about 900 deaths among Filipinos. If we add the other cases of Filipinos abroad, then we have more than 1,000. Overall, if you look at the data, a quarter of all cases and all deaths of Filipinos are actually migrants. So that's how directly affected the Filipinos are. So even before the virus spread in the Filipinos were already infected in other parts of the world. And the gender dimension of that is, since many of the Filipino women are in the frontline services overseas, and they are in the precarious jobs, jobs that interface a lot with people, then a lot of the overseas Filipino women have also become victims of COVID. So just some statistics, more than 80% of women of OFWs in the elementary jobs, domestic work, cleaners, laborers, are actually women. And those in the clerical and services sector, more than almost 60% are women. So again, that gives you a context of the gendered patterns of jobs overseas, increasing the risk to infection of women. So the first gap and the first risk is on the health itself. No? And we have seen that. And as Lennon and others already highlighted before, there's a disproportionate impact on women whenever there are crises and public emergencies. This also happened in past pandemics like Zika and SARS, that the women were disproportionately affected. And of course, the risk in increases in VAU and violence against women and gender-based violence. And the intersection of the different factors, like the jobs of the migrants, their visa status, their health, their age, and of course their gender, intersect to compound the effects. So where are the specific gaps that we need to address? One, as my colleagues have said, is in data. We have some data, but we need consistent disaggregated, not only in terms of sex, but also migration status and job, so that we would know how to address them. We also need data on the returned migrants, for example. What are their intentions and needs? What are their plans and capacities? So that then future interventions should be able to address their needs properly. I've already discussed that there's a high risk of exposure to infection. In fact, many of the women infected are actually also domestic workers. Many data come out that they got the infection from their employers themselves. So that illustrates the danger that even the houses, which are the workplaces of the women migrant workers, become points of infection. Another risk factor and gap is in the information, especially overseas. Many of the migrants, even if the host government, they provide information, many a times is in the language of the country of destination, for example, in Arabic or in Chinese. And although they are available, they are not necessarily understandable to the migrants, especially advisories and other stuff. Also, updated and accurate information is hard to come by, especially during lockdowns. But couple that with problems about false information in social media, or even cases of scams and deceptions. So this increases the risk to a lot of problems of migrant workers. The other gap and issue that we need to recognize is even before COVID, the cases of violence and abuse are already quite common among migrants. I'm flashing to you some of the statistics that these are past data, 2013 to 2016. On average, now we have more than 4,000 distressed migrants assisted by the embassies every year, and 3/4 of these are women. More than 400 cases on average each year. 90% of these are women, and more than 13,000 repatriated, and 3/4 are women. So these cases do not stop with the pandemic. So in fact, the problem would be that with lockdowns and other restrictive measures, the tendency is, especially as my colleagues were saying, if the abusive employer is locked down with a migrant worker, then probably the cases of violence within the workplace or the homes of the employer will continue or will intensify. And of course, we have seen also in the Philippines, but especially abroad, the disruption or the reduction in services available, including essential services, no? On health services, shelters, financial aid, justice, and policing, especially in cases of abuse. The additional problem actually of migrants is many host countries, destination countries, don't include OFWs in their relief operations or amelioration programs. So it becomes then the key role of the embassy or the consulate to provide even food relief packs or hygiene packs or masks to the Filipinos because they could not get it from anywhere else. Also, since because they're on lockdown, no income, the migrants don't have money to actually buy supplies or even hygiene products. Mobility restrictions, like in the Philippines, have actually increased the risk to abuse. We have received at least 5 cases in March where the migrants who have been abused, they could not even escape from the employer. So one in Kuwait, in Saudi, or some other countries. And also, they have an additional risk that when they dare to go out, they actually have a threat to being arrested or detained and even deported. So it becomes a life-threatening risk, not only because of the pandemic, but also a threat to being arrested and deported. And many times the migrants' documents have been withheld by abusive employers. So then that also increases the problem of not being able to get away from the abusive situation. The biggest problem, especially in the coming days, is the loss of jobs. So I'm just illustrating here that, for example, overseas, more than 400,000 migrants have already been displaced, and more than 50,000 have already been repatriated. And DOLE expects that at least 40,000 more will be returning home in the next 2 months. That's just the displacement abroad. Locally, the displacement, originally NEDA was saying that it might displace 1.8 million workers, but only in April, that means 3 months since the pandemic spread in the Philippines, already 5 million workers have become jobless as of end of April. So that's how much bigger the problem of unemployment has become. So since a lot of these displaced workers, including from overseas, are actually women migrants, so the question would be, what is the income and how will they survive in the future? As Oye was saying, even in cases of reduced or loss of income, the women becomes the care providers to ensure that the family still survives despite the loss of income. Another risk factor is because of the loss of jobs overseas, there is a projected decline in remittances. Former Secretary Pernia was saying that perhaps between 20 to 30% reduction in remittances. And this will have a very drastic impact on the families, which can drive many OFW families into poverty. The reason is even before, in the last 10 to 15 years, 96% of OFW families are dependent on remittances even for food. And more than 60% are dependent on it for education and many other expenses. And only a small proportion, 6%, have investments or save out of remittances. So meaning, if you reduce the remittance at this point in time, suddenly, many of the families might not have alternatives to where they will get their basic needs. So the impact of that will be very drastic. And again, women will be disproportionately impacted on that. Many of the migrants, the next risk factor is on social protection. Many of the migrants, although these are mandatory, they fall out of the social security system or the social protection. So for example, in 2015, only less than half of OFWs are members of SSS. So that illustrates to you that therefore the safety nets are not there. And therefore the increased risk of this is it prevents the women therefore to move out of an abusive situation because they don't have safety net, no unemployment insurance or others. And if they do get impacted or displaced by the crisis, then they don't have a cushion to absorb the cost or to find provident help. So I've already discussed about the massive and sudden repatriation of migrants. The big risk here is what do they do after they return to the Philippines. Now, this is not even counting the stranding for at least a month or several weeks of many of 50,000 that already arrived in Manila last time. Another big risk factor is, as Oye was saying, on reintegration. Yeah, so it's good that they were able to come back after they lost their jobs or income abroad. But then what will happen to them in the next few months? Many don't have assets or provident savings or capital. Many don't have necessarily the skills to do livelihoods or enterprises. And reskilling measures are not necessarily in place, especially at the local level. So this is a big action point. The additional risk here is in the coming months when migrants will be pressured actually to find jobs and they would want again to go abroad as a way if they could not reintegrate here. The threat of illegal recruitment and trafficking situation both here and overseas. So many illegal recruiters or traffickers might exploit this situation to victimize many of the women migrants. And finally, as the discussion about recovery is ongoing, the risk would be that government will develop the recovery plans, reinforcing a new normal that perpetuates many of the inequalities and then the gender norms. So what we need is to have a better normal and to make sure that these are based on gender responsive and rights-based principles, and most especially that this involves women and people in terms of formulation. So yeah, I will not discuss too much on the responses, but as a matter of strategy, Safe and Fair wants that we not only address the gaps that were discussed, but make sure that it results to empowerment, increasing the voice, choice, and agency of the women migrants. The ILO has come up with some pillars on how do we address the economic and social responses after the lockdowns. And Safe and Fair is acting on at least these areas of work in the coming months. So on services, how to make them more gender responsive and accessible, and how to involve the local governments and migrant resource centers nationally and locally. On data, how to make them more sexist aggregated and provide more access to the migrants and families. On training and empowerment, how to link the different migrant communities overseas with their hometowns here and maximize the use of digital platforms and empower the women to use them safely in terms of organizing and learning through the digital platforms. And finally, to make sure that the social protection and reintegration and recovery programs become participatory in formulation. And in particular, ILO has just approved our Convention 190 on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. we want this to be part of the standards that the governments will use in building the better normal. So I'll end with this, and yeah, I hope we can discuss more in the discussions. Thank you very much. Montes?
Thank you so much, Rex. Okay, so I think we should get the ball rolling towards how we will build this better normal. Yes. We have so many questions. I think some of the questions have already been answered because they were coming in since the start of the first speaker. But there is a bunch of questions around digital services. One in the area of how about those who do not have access to the web? You know? And because we have, you know, I think mentioned by CHR, e-lawyering, or even the OFWs who may not have access to the internet, how do they actually access these services? That because, you know, online services now the main strategy give in this pandemic. So that's one question. And also around the area of online services, there was a question to the UN Women regarding the training that they provide. There's a lot of interest, Ms. Len, in the training that UN Women provides for countering hate speech and misogyny. So how do we now improve this ability to access these digital services? So perhaps who would like to, maybe I can call on UN Women first to talk about the training, the skills, and then let's go on to how do we address the issue of access from the other speakers. Ms. Len.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I reached out to the program manager in charge of this particular program because at the moment we are really recruiting for youth who are interested to be part of the pilot activity. So as soon as I get the information, I'll be sharing it to the person who raised the question, because I'd like for us to really be able to send the proper link so they could register and be part of this initiative and advocacy as well.
Do you have a criteria for who can join this?
The target
training?
at the moment is really among the youth for now, because recognizing that they are the ones very active online, we would like to raise their awareness further and really the sensitivities on how to handle the different spur of, you know, the word exchanges that, you know, that, how do you say, the different bad mouthing online. So there will really be sensitivity raising and helping them navigate the online space to better tackle and address those issues.
I see. So it's that kind of skill. It's not the technological skill.
I hope there would be part of that.
Okay.
I'm really trying to get the information, but I think there will be a portion of that.
Okay, so thank you for that. And of course, there's still the issue, particularly to, I think, CHR, Commissioner Karen, and to Sir Rex and to Prof. Oyi. What do we do with our OFWs, our Filipino citizens who don't even have access to the web, and some don't even have, one person raised, have access to radio or even traditional forms of communication? Yeah. So maybe CHR, Ms. Commissioner Karen? Yes.
Well, of course, that question, don't quite know how to answer that actually, because if you're in a private sphere, it's really very difficult for OFWs to be able to access help. But we've been actually encouraging our embassies to reach out to Filipinos. In fact, some embassies have actually participated in community gatherings during OFW's day offs, and they normally congregate in parks and all that. No? Aside from that, well, if it's OFWs, then national human rights institutions, our counterparts in different countries have also responded to our requests for assistance as well.
Okay.
And,
what about our citizens in the Philippines? Because you said, let's say there's a human rights violation you want to report. but you don't have internet access.
Yeah.
What
Actually,
is their recourse?
some cities have provided free internet access. That's one. Second is, I think I wrote this already in the question and answer box, that it's important for LGUs to be able to address this challenge. And community-based monitoring, community support groups are very important, especially when communication facilities are not available. So that's the short answer that I want to give that.
Okay, so we really rely on the LGUs. Now, Prof. Oyi,
Yeah.
can we hear from you for OFWs or women being trafficked? Yeah. Do they have access in your experience? And what if they don't have access to internet, to the web? Or if they have limited communication access? Could you turn on your mic, Prof. Oyi? Just turn on the mic. Yes. Okay. Oops, turn it on again. It was turned off. Just one click. Okay.
Okay na?
Yes, okay now.
Okay. Yeah, it says here mute. It's baliktad. And in my case, I think for most OFWs, they have at least one cell phone. Okay, so I think the most accessible is the cell phone, and if they have an SMS that they can, in fact, write short messages either to the embassy and or the NGOs in a certain area. And this is, I think, very critical. The role of civil society in helping women in distress, women who are experiencing domestic abuse, who have been trafficked, who are OFWs under very oppressive employers. That's one. Normally, in a democratic setting, like in Western countries, they would be given some kind of an orientation and contact numbers and their rights. This is not true for every country, but certainly in those countries which have active NGOs, women NGOs, migrant rights organizations, or even just civic organizations. So this is one. For instance, in the Middle East, it's very important, almost impossible to have human rights organizations, but there are civic organizations are doing their bit. Also, in many cases, distressed OFWs have been able to access FB, Facebook, and very often the distress call is expressed in Facebook. No, we've seen this in some of the most really cases of and I think those are two of the things that I have been in my mind is the accessibility of cell phones and FB, if possible, that can be utilized from the embassy, and reaching out to not only to our embassies but to the NGOs that may provide a channel for them to express their problem.
Thank you, Prof. Oyi. Sir Rex, I would also want to add lang, because another question that came in, related question is, what do we do given government agencies' hotlines and emails are inaccessible or not responding? So maybe also you could address that.
Hi. Yes, as Mamay was saying, relative to perhaps the general population, the usage of migrants of digital technologies, I think, wider. In fact, in the past, we have trained them. I used to live in Hong Kong for 20 years, and I was a survivor of SARS. So in both cases, in the abuses, we have actually trained migrants how to use the cell phone to document evidence. If they were beaten, or so before they can go to the hospital, at least they can get a photo of the abuse or such. So yes, Mama Oy was saying, migrants are quite comfortable already. In fact, the challenge is more on misuse of it, because sometimes, or perhaps wrong use of it, sometimes when they're abused, they post everything on the Facebook, their passport, their picture, their ID number, their work permit, which would easily make them vulnerable to identity theft. So that's why we need to therefore capacitate the migrants to make sure that they safely use all these technologies. I think the challenge more is on the families and then the people back in the communities here in the Philippines, because then, yeah, they don't even have signal. So the use of both cell phone or smartphones, yeah. And I think the opportunity that was opened by COVID was people became more comfortable, including migrants and families, on using online channels. So I think now the challenge is how to increase access to that, how to give more reliable connection, but also on capacitating the migrants on both ends to use. Now, on the question of whether how better can we use digital technology, uh, I think including migrants in financial inclusion through the digital channels is also one, because it gives them assurance that if they safely use the channels, it can also be actually a secure channel to report their abuses and violations. So, for example, Safe and Fair is trying to put together under one virtual migrant resource centers portal the different services, so that then migrants can just go a one-stop site where they can access PCW, CHR, DSWD, OWA, and click this. Of course, the question is somebody at the other end of the line to ensure? There are challenges there, but I think the practical consideration is just continue to improve that, not 24/7 access and response at the end of the hotlines. But the
Right.
hotlines are there.
Right. Okay. And as you said, as you all said, these are situations even before the pandemic, and will not necessarily be resolved when the pandemic has a vaccine. So, also that there was a question, I think mainly for everyone, maybe, but maybe for you and women. Maternal health care, do you think it is a neglected area at this time?
I would say it has been a neglected area since even before COVID time. It's really now highlighting the challenges that we are facing when it comes to access to these services more and more, especially for women who are really not able to pay them, not able to pay for these services and access to hospitals. So yes, it is going to really be more and more a challenge for women who would need more support in this area. But that would have to be really a challenge for us and the government to make sure these things are set in place, especially that there are resources allocated to tackle COVID. And we hope that this could also include extending that support to women who needs maternal health care as well.
Okay, so it's further aggravated, is what you're saying, the situation, because it's not being addressed. Okay, and the GBV was also a question maybe for Prof. Oyi and other panelists, Commissioner Karen, Sir Rex. What are the challenges to addressing gender-based violence during this time of the pandemic, apart from the digital services in terms of access and disability skills? What are other challenges to addressing gender-based violence during this pandemic? Prof. Oyi, maybe first.
Yeah. The issue of domestic violence has come up, no? And this is when before that was already quite a crisis. With the lockdown, I think it's even more urgent that this issue is addressed, because can you imagine your perpetrator is with you day in and day out, and also with the children. That's one issue, that you have no escape coming from your perpetrator, simply because of the physical lockdown that is imposed on everyone. And I think this should be made an exception in the policies of the government, because one size does not fit all. No, so you lock every. It's as if you have thrown the problem under the table and ignore the realities that women face. So I think there has to be a specific policy that does not exempt the attention given to violence against women, particularly domestic violence, by the Women's Day. So I've been asking is this still very active? Because if it is, then it should really monitor at the time of COVID. The second very disturbing problem is the fact that, we have a very high percentage of sexual abuse of children, incest, and that doesn't seem to be coming out in the figures. And this is, again, particularly important for young girls, living with families or with their mothers as OFW. So that leaves them with the father, the perpetrator of incest and sexual abuse. So I think these two cases have to be recognized as urgent problems that needs, some kind of an exemption. How to report this is, again, a challenge. Again, as I think just about everybody has SMS, and this is the quickest way they can get assistance. But this is SOS to our police and to our VAU desk, that they have to just be quick, alert at monitoring these incidences. When there was no lockdown, this was happening, and how much more at this time. Yes, thank you.
Sorry, my mic was off. Anything to add, Commissioner Karen?
Yes. Well, just to relate to you some of the reports that we have monitored, is that when a woman comes to the barangay or village office, they would be told that maybe you can just complain after the lockdown or after this pandemic. And it took us, so she would go to the city level city desk officer, who said the same thing, but we did call them to say, these problems don't stop in this pandemic. And aside from that, the challenge also of the issuance of barangay or village protection orders for women. And we know that this is done within a period of 15 days. So there was also a discussion online with Senator Risa Hontiveros proposing that this period should be extended.
Yes.
And then we did monitor transport services are very, very difficult when women want to get out of their houses to go to a shelter. And then when they go to a shelter, we've had reports that even the shelter is closed. So we did provide for temporary shelter for about 5 women already. But we raised this issue to local governments, and we said, you cannot close these shelters. We must be able to protect these women. But of course, we must abide by the public health emergency requirements of physical distancing and hygiene protocols as well.
Mm-hmm. So what I guess what we're saying here is the stay home, stay safe doesn't necessarily apply on the issue of GBV. Yeah, I think that was also raised by the LGBT community, I believe, who are also forced to stay at home. Did Sir Rex and Ms. Lennon have anything to add on that issue? Because GBV, I think, seems to be a very big issue cutting across the various sectors, right? Sir Rex, maybe first? Just unmute your mic if you wish to speak. No? Okay. Ms. Lenlen.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
I'd like to add to that. I think we'd like to raise that the issue of GBV and domestic violence or VOW has been really something that we are challenged since before COVID. And right now what we are seeing is the tendency of the supposed to be service providers to dismiss these issues and cases for, as protection for themselves. And I would have to agree to Commissioner Karen's answer that the problem will not stop even if we have COVID or even if COVID vanished, we vanished COVID. What is also apparent from what we are seeing is those women who are on a work from home setup right now, their employees are not made aware of their situation. So even if they are victims of the violence, they are not able to report, or they are not able to deliver the work they need to deliver. So it has also become an issue for those women working at home and not do not intend to report it because they are very afraid that they might lose their work or they might be judged in their workplace if they report or share this situation. So yeah, I definitely think we need to really be more aware and get more campaigns around this.
Okay, thank you. Sir Rex, did you have anything to add on that issue? No pressure.
Yeah.
Baka lang meron.
Yeah, just quickly, I think addressing the structural basis of violence is essential to be institutionalized. For example, lack of social protection. I think it's illustrated that during pandemics especially, it's difficult no matter how much relief you give or food packs. If you don't have health insurance, retirement insurance, unemployment insurance, then you grasp at straws and you become therefore more vulnerable. So in terms of strategy and response, I think preparedness, especially for migrants on return, should be integrated in all the programs on migrants, including in the embassies. Because this is not the first and this is not new. It will happen again and perhaps even worse. So the important thing is institutionalize the structural capacity so that women would be able to survive or become more resilient in instances like these. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay pa kayo? There are so many questions. Okay, because actually there's also a number of questions around economic empowerment. No, how do we address this? In fact, they're also asking how can local governments address this economic empowerment, or someone referred to it as financial literacy. Yes, do we have any existing programs, let's say in UN Women or in the CHR, to address this issue, Ms. Lenlen?
There are several organizations running and really delivering financial literacy workshops.
And are they working with LGUs?
And education. The problem is not a lot of them really are linking up with local government units as what we hope they could do, so they can expand their reach and really educate more. There is an opportunity, and I know Rex knows about this, that for integration purposes for migrant workers, there has this partnership between LGUs and the different NGOs to run and provide financial education sessions for migrant workers and their family members. But now I think we need to highlight this more, and this has to be extended to all the different LGUs. When we were asked in the past webinars, how could we prepare ourselves, the businesses, the families, to tackle this pandemic? The preparation should have happened way before when it comes to really saving money, trying to manage resources, and understanding how you could really save up for the rainy days. But now that we're here, everyone really is trying to count on the resources from government and donations, or the social amelioration program, which is something, of course, that could help, but in the short term. So we hope to see really more organizations and more agencies would be bold enough to do and deliver these education sessions to the local level, at the community level, and that this could also use resources, and it could really be a good investment on that area as well. But we also need to be mindful that financial literacy can also be a tool for furthering abuse and exploitation, especially if there are business motives behind it. So what we really would need to call for is a very well-crafted financial education for the community that is not biased towards any businesses, but towards empowering women and those in the vulnerable sector.
Okay. Commissioner Karen, anything to add? Oh, yes, Sir Rex, yes. Go ahead,
Ako
yes.
na, Kang Karen. Okay, yeah,
Uh,
just to build on Lenon's answer.
okay.
Yes, we have to go beyond financial literacy. In fact, as I was saying, after my 20 years in Hong Kong, we have built a cooperative there of migrants. We have reintegration programs. We have bought farms back in the Philippines. And when I returned in the last 5 years, we were actually training local governments and families of migrants now on reintegration programs, building cooperatives, building livelihoods. My issue there would be, as Lennon was saying, many migrants have undergone so many livelihood training, starter kits, etc. But these have not graduated into sustainable incomes. So that's why I was saying, no, most is because there's no asset. After training, how do you start a business? So there are loan windows, but these are not necessarily accessible or near. So that's why I was saying, in addition to what are now in place, because there are in place NRC who has reintegration programs under OWA. Actually, there are PESO, no? Public Employment Services Office of LGUs that are supposed to help you. And there's a migration committee in many of the LGUs as part of the Migration and Development Initiative. So instead of recreating, I think the important thing really is to reinforce this and then incentivize them so that it's not just out of compliance that people will attend trainings, but there's really mentoring and pathways, from training, building assets and capital until you really will. But that's only half of the equation. My advocacy have always been, not everyone is an entrepreneur. So no matter how much enterprise development you give them, not everyone can go into business. The 90% of the migrants needs to have provident savings like retirement, so that in your stint overseas, after leaving, even without a business, then you have accumulated the same amount of money that you stayed overseas. And government has to create a national program for this so that it's incentivized and matched up by local funds. So I think, yeah, we have to rethink a lot of the strategies on economic empowerment for migrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Rex. Okay. Well, it's almost 5, and I know this panel could go on and on because you're just so very committed and passionate. But at this point, I think I will ask now for your some parting shots, and I want to ask maybe and return to the title of our event, our webinar, because we said caring. In this time of COVID, in your parting shots, what do we mean? Women? Can I start with maybe Professor Oyi?
Okay. Yes. A while ago, I've shown a kind of a combination of different elements that what we mean by care. I think care is more than just giving them food, giving them assistance at the time of COVID. We have to think of a holistic way of assisting that includes not only the responding to the material needs, but looking at the mental health and condition of people who are, terribly affected by this, the loss of income, the loss of jobs. So as much as we need to provide them with, these material needs, we also have to mind how are they doing psychologically and mentally. And of course, the third is for them to be able to think of the new normal. After the crisis, what do I do? So I think this area is something that is really needed, particularly for women who have, have no financial base to proceed with their lives. And so I think, just to continue with our discussion a while ago, that there should be what we call financial assistance with no interest and with no payment, as a start-up capital for groups of women that can look forward to a period where they have something after the pandemic. And secondly, I think we have to harness all the combined resources of government that will make it possible for people to be able to overcome these issues. I'm talking specifically of, TESDA, Department of DTI, of industry and of local government, and of social work department. So first of all, respond to the material needs as well as the psychological and mental need in a gender responsive way. And third, to provide them with the promise and with the possibility that they can start their lives anew after the pandemic with some sort of livelihood to start on. But as Rex was saying, it's never really realistic to just depend on one initiative of one individual, but that it's possible to have groups of women, of collectives of women that can start thinking of the period ahead of the COVID pandemic. So it has to be holistic.
Thank you, Prof.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Oyi. Salamat. Commissioner Karen?
Well, what can I say? I think we just have to work together and become more aware of how women are living during this time, because that's the only way we can actually get to know how they are, and we take the cue from there. But one of the things that perhaps we can probably do is pave the way for them to tell their stories, be a platform for storytelling. And I think the Commission on Human Rights as a Gender Ombud has been doing its share, but we cannot do it alone. We need all of you there. We need to put out the stories of women out there so that we can learn from them and we can address the problems that they raise. It's just that we need to talk more, engage more, and listen to the stories of our fellow women. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir Rex? Your mic.
Hi.
Here.
Okay, sige, thank you. Akala ko I'll be last again.
Sorry.
Well, to me, well, caring would be ensuring that the women are empowered, that we help them and support them. Because these problems will not go away. This is not the first. No? As I was saying, we survived 2002 SARS, and I've seen the resiliency of many of the women at Ws, including the migrant domestic workers. So this is not the first, and this will not be the last. But making sure that they belong to a community, that they are organized and networked, they can communicate, now maximize the digital platforms, so that for whatever problems, including these, that will arise, they have a participation and they can say what they need, you know, and how it can be addressed. So really empowering. And of course, the second leg is ensuring the material welfare, because that's why they went overseas, at least for migrants, ensuring their jobs, their livelihoods, and their social protection, and also preventing damage and abuse. So that means nothing new in a sense, but perhaps rethink our strategy on how to make them more organic and resilient, review the gaps in policies, and do not throw away the 40 years of the struggles that we have in addressing the needs of the migrants and women. So improve on them for a better normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Rex. And last but not least, Ms. Lenlen. Parting shots.
Yes, thank you. For the UN Women, it's really caring in time of COVID is making sure that no one is left behind, especially women and girls, and making sure that they are given the voice. We are mindful about their situation, understanding why they are not able to access what they need to access, and paving way for them to be able to access the different services they need, opportunities for them to be able to bounce back, and really make sure that they are empowered enough to decide for themselves what they want to do and where they want to go. It is also a call for us to really work together to make sure that their voices are heard, that their stories are incorporated in all of the future plans and programming, not just of the government, but it's an appeal as well to all the different organizations, international, multilateral organizations, donor organizations, for us to be more mindful that this needs to really be at the center of the programming in terms of response and recovery plans moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was such a fruitful discussion. I prepared a short closing, but I think now at this point, I just want to say maybe the closing for today's webinar is really a call for, coming from our speakers, a call for caring collaborative governance, especially to government, but not only, for non-government organizations, for the private sector, for schools, for churches, and for communities, in addressing not just this pandemic crisis, but the crisis that all of you have talked about even before the pandemic. So I hope, I want to thank all of our speakers today on behalf of CEFAL and on behalf of the sponsoring organizations, that is UN Women, International Labour Organization, Commission on Human Rights, and the Miriam College Women and Gender Institute, led by CEFAL. We are grateful for your time, and grateful, of course, to all of the participants who sent in their questions and enriched our discussion. So maraming salamat. And before we say goodbye, we just want to plug the next CEFAL webinar. I'm not from CEFAL, but I will plug now. I have the role of, don't be confused, okay? Yes, here we have the next upcoming webinar of CEFAL, also with a bunch of other organizations. So for those who are interested, tune into that. So kung wala na, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. No, to all of our speakers, thank you to our participants, and keep safe.
Thank you all, and keep safe. Thank you.